He fastened the necklace around her throat like it was nothing, like his wife wasn't standing 10 feet away, watching every second of it. That moment, that single public act of cruelty dressed up as ceremony, is where this story truly begins. Not with a gunshot, not with a war, but with a man's pride and a woman's silence that every Don in that room immediately understood to be the most dangerous thing they had ever witnessed. If you were Seraphine Arden, standing in that ballroom with 500 eyes on you, what would you do? Before we go further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way through, because what happens next will leave you breathless. Smash the like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Part 1. The Necklace. The Black Sovereign Summit was the kind of event that only happened once in a generation, and everyone inside the Meridian Grand knew it. The chandeliers alone cost more than most people earned in a decade. The floral arrangements on each table, white orchids, black roses, stems wrapped in platinum wire, had been flown in from 4 different countries. The carpet running the length of the central hall was so thick that when a man walked across it, his footsteps made no sound at all, which was fitting, because everything important that happened in rooms like this happened without sound. Seraphine Arden arrived at 7:43 in the evening, 17 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. She wore a slate gray gown, not black, not ivory, but that particular shade of gray that existed between mourning and authority. Her hair was pinned at the back of her neck. No jewelry. She had done that deliberately. She always did. The men in the room noticed her the moment she walked through the door. Not because she demanded attention, because she moved like someone who had already accounted for every person in the space and found them manageable. There was a difference between a woman who was beautiful and a woman who made you feel like you were being quietly evaluated. Seraphine had always been the second kind. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, not champagne, and took her position at the left side of the head table. The seat beside her was empty. It had been empty for the past 20 minutes. Cassian was backstage somewhere, doing what Cassian always did before a public moment, performing the version of himself he wanted everyone else to see. Across the room, she recognized faces. Enzo Ferrante from the Eastern Corridor, older now, heavier, but his eyes still sharp as they had ever been. The Marchetti twins, standing apart from each other the way they always did in mixed company, habit born from 30 years of never being sure who in the room wanted one or both of them dead. Ambassador Theron Kyle, who was not technically a Don, but whose presence at any gathering of this kind said everything that needed to be said about where the real levers of power connected to the political world. And then there was Vivienne Moreau. Seraphine saw her from across the ballroom and felt nothing she hadn't already prepared herself to feel. Vivienne was standing near the eastern archway in a dress the color of arterial red, the kind of color chosen by someone who wanted to be the most visible person in the room. She was laughing at something a young underboss was saying, one hand resting lightly on his arm, her head tilted at exactly the angle that made her seem both approachable and untouchable simultaneously. She was skilled, Seraphine would give her that. Seraphine set her water glass down on the white tablecloth and watched Vivienne for exactly 4 seconds. Then she looked away. The ceremony was supposed to be simple. In the tradition of the Continental Accord, the binding compact that had held the alliance of founding families together for more than a century, the Donna Necklace was presented once per summit to the woman recognized by the assembled Dons as the rightful Donna of the reigning household. It was not a ceremony of romance, it was a ceremony of covenant. The woman who wore the necklace was not simply a wife. She was the acknowledged anchor of the alliance, the one whose relationships, negotiations, and quiet accountabilities held the web together when the men in the room were busy pointing guns at each other. Every Don in that ballroom understood what the necklace meant. Every single one of them. The lights shifted at 8 o'clock precisely. The room quieted the way rooms do when the person everyone has been waiting for finally makes his entrance. Cassian Vescari walked through the main doors with the particular kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of never being told no. He was 51 years old, silver at his temples now, still broad through the shoulders, still wearing a suit that cost more than most criminal operations earned in a month. He moved through the crowd with handshakes and shoulder grips, a word here, a laugh there. the practiced intimacy of a man who had learned that making people feel seen was its own form of control. He did not look at Seraphine when he took his position at the front of the room. She noticed. The assembled dons settled into their places. The room was quieter than it had been all evening. Even the servers along the walls went still. Old Ferrante's head of protocol, a gray-suited man named Ducci, who had been running ceremony logistics at these summits for 27 years, brought the necklace forward on a velvet tray. It was extraordinary. A platinum chain of interlocking links, each one engraved with a different family crest in miniature, set with a central pendant of black diamond and old ivory, worth approximately $4 million at current market rates, worth considerably more than that in terms of what it represented. Seraphine stood. That was the protocol. The Donna stood. The Don received the tray. The Don presented the necklace. She stood, and she waited, and she felt 500 pairs of eyes on her, and she breathed slowly through her nose. Cassian took the tray from Ducci. He lifted the necklace. He turned, and he walked past his wife. The room did not gasp immediately. It took approximately 2 seconds during which every person present processed what they were seeing and concluded it could not possibly be what it looked like. And then Cassian reached Vivienne Moreau at the edge of the gathered crowd, and Vivienne tilted her chin up with an expression of practiced surprise that was so obviously rehearsed it was almost insulting, and Cassian fastened the necklace around her throat. Then the room understood. The sound that moved through the ballroom was not quite a gasp and not quite silence. It was something between a collective held breath that carried within it 500 separate calculations about what this meant and what it would cost and who was going to have to respond to it. Cassian turned to face the room with the necklace clasp secured and his hand resting on Vivienne's bare shoulder, and he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Gentlemen, the future of the Vescry household stands before you. I trust you will have your full respect." Seraphine did not move, did not flinch, did not look at the floor or at Vivienne or at the necklace. She looked at Cassian with an expression that could have been cut from stone, and she thought, "You have no idea what you have just done." She was not the only one thinking it. Enzo Ferrante, 73 years old, patriarch of the oldest family represented at the summit, looked at the necklace around Vivienne Moreau's throat. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Seraphine, and he lowered his eyes, slowly, deliberately, in a gesture that was not submission and was not sympathy. It was recognition. Beside him, Marchetti the Elder did the same. Then Theron Kael, who understood better than almost anyone what the Donna necklace actually was and what placing it on the wrong woman had just set in motion. One by one, across the room, the oldest and most powerful men present lowered their eyes toward Seraphine, not toward Vivienne, toward Seraphine. Cassian was still smiling. He read their silence as discomfort, as jealousy perhaps, or cautious neutrality from men too smart to publicly contradict him. He had expected some resistance, had even prepared remarks to address it after the celebration. He was not a man who misread rooms. He had never misread a room in his life. He was misreading this one catastrophically. Vivienne laughed softly and touched the pendant at her throat and leaned into Cassian's side. And the young underbosses in the room who didn't know any better began to clap. Uncertain, scattered applause that faded almost immediately when the senior dons didn't join it. Seraphine picked up her water glass from the table. She drank the last of it. She set it down. She looked at no one in particular, which was its own kind of statement. Then she smoothed the front of her gown, turned, and walked out of the ballroom. No scene, no words, no backward glance. The doors closed behind her and the room sat with what had just happened, and 3 separate dons immediately reached for their phones. The car she'd arranged was waiting at the north exit. Not the main entrance, the north exit, which opened onto a service alley that ran behind the hotel. She had organized this detail 6 weeks ago, not because she'd known exactly what Cassian would do tonight, but because she had known that whatever he did, she would not want to be seen leaving. The driver was a man named Ord who had worked for her. Specifically for her, not for the Vescari household, a distinction she had maintained carefully for 11 years. And he said nothing when she got in, only pulled away from the curb with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that some evenings were not for conversation. She sat in the back seat and looked out the window at the city moving past, and she allowed herself, for exactly the duration of one city block, to feel the full weight of what had happened in that room. Not the humiliation. Humiliation required caring what those people thought, and she had long since moved past that particular vulnerability. What she felt was something more precise, the weight of a calculation that had just shifted, a board that had been arranged with great care, now suddenly rearranged by someone who didn't understand what any of the pieces meant. She pulled out her phone and opened a message thread with no name attached to it, just a set of coordinates that changed weekly. She typed, "It happened. Begin the first sequence." The response came back in 40 seconds. "Understood. Timeline?" She typed, "Dawn." She put the phone away. She looked out the window at the city she had spent the better part of 2 decades quietly learning to hold in her hands. The restaurants and the warehouses and the counting houses and the law offices and the private airfields and the political offices and the harbor authority and the federal district courts. The invisible geography of influence that existed underneath the visible geography of streets. Cashin believed he had built an empire. He had. But he had built it the way a man builds a house on land he doesn't actually own, by pouring everything into the structure while someone else quietly held the deed. She had never told him, not because she wanted the secret for its own sake, but because men like Cassian could only be what they were if they believed the story they told themselves. The moment he understood the real architecture, he would have tried to possess it. And the moment he tried to possess it, it would have collapsed. The whole careful network, the relationships, the loyalties, the understandings negotiated over years, ran on something that had nothing to do with fear or money or force. It ran on trust. And trust, once commanded, immediately begins to die. So she had held it quietly. She had managed it quietly. She had kept the empire alive for 18 years through the kind of work that never appeared in any ledger or any report or any ceremony. Until tonight, when her husband had placed a necklace on another woman's throat in front of every Don in America and declared for the record that the quiet work didn't matter. The funny thing about declarations like that was what they actually accomplished. They didn't transfer power. They didn't create new authority. What they did, what Cassian had done tonight without understanding any of it, was remove the one person in the room whose presence had been the only reason anyone tolerated him. By the time Seraphine arrived at the house, not the main estate, the secondary residence she maintained in the northern district, the one Cassian believed was simply a property investment, her phone had received 17 messages, 12 from known contacts, 5 from numbers she recognized but hadn't expected to hear from quite this quickly. She sat at the kitchen table and read each one. "Ferrante, the covenant is not so easily reassigned. I thought you should hear that from me directly. Marchetti Elder. We remember who negotiated the Eastern Corridor Agreement. We remember who has always negotiated it. Kale. The families are watching. Be careful, but don't be too careful." The other messages were shorter, check-ins, confirmations, a few that were simply a single word, ready. She set the phone face down on the table and looked at the wall. From somewhere in the house, she heard the soft sound of a kettle beginning to heat. One of her people, a woman named Risa, who handled the secondary residence, and who was one of perhaps 40 individuals on the planet who understood the full scope of what Seraphine had quietly built, appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Tea," Risa said. Not a question. "Tea," Seraphine confirmed. Risa set 2 cups on the table and sat down across from her. They had known each other for 19 years, which was long enough that certain conversations didn't require many words. "He really did it," Risa said. "He really did it. In front of Ferrante. In front of everyone." Risa was quiet for a moment, then, "Silas Creed." "Yes." "You're certain?" Seraphine looked at her. The timing of the manipulation, the specific leverage on Cashin's pride, the choice of public venue, the selection of a woman whose connection to the network was shallow enough that she couldn't understand what she was being used to do. She wrapped both hands around her teacup. "Yes, I'm certain." "What does Silas actually want?" "The same thing men like Silas always want." She looked at the steam rising from the cup. "Everything, all at once, without having done the work to deserve any of it." Risa nodded slowly. "He has no idea you're aware of him. He believes I'm sitting in a hotel ballroom absorbing my public humiliation." A pause. "Which is exactly where he needs me to be in his mind for the next 72 hours. And instead, Seraphine said, we begin. She lifted the cup to her lips. Outside the kitchen window, somewhere in the city, the first of the shipping routes was already going dark. Cassian would discover it by morning. He would be confused, then alarmed, then furious. He would start making calls and find that calls weren't being returned. He would issue orders and find that orders were reaching their destinations and simply sitting there, unexecuted, in a silence that had no explanation he could name. He would look for enemies in all the places enemies were supposed to be. He would look at rival families, at federal pressure, at his own underbosses. He would not look at his wife. He never had. That had always been the one thing she'd relied on. That had always been the one thing that was about to cost him everything. The kettle went quiet. The house settled around her. And Seraphine Arden, Donna of the Continental Accord. Whether any necklace said so or not, sat at her kitchen table and began to dismantle the man who had forgotten, in one catastrophic moment of pride, exactly whose hands had always been holding the world up. The first thing Cassian noticed was the coffee. It wasn't there. Every morning for 18 years, the kitchen staff at the Viscari main estate had a cup waiting on the counter by 6:15. Not on the table, not served at the dining room, on the counter, where he could pick it up walking through without breaking stride. Dark roast, no sugar, the temperature held at exactly the degree where it wouldn't scald going down. A small thing. The kind of small thing that only registered when it stopped happening. He stood in the kitchen at 6:22 in the morning in his shirt and suit trousers, and looked at the empty counter and felt the first thread of unease move through him before he'd even fully understood why. The kitchen was also empty. No staff. The overhead lights were on, but the prep surfaces were bare, and the industrial coffee maker at the far end of the counter sat cold and unwashed from the night before. He went to the hallway and found his household manager, a man named Purtis, who had been running the domestic operations of the estate for 9 years. Purtis was standing in the hall with his phone pressed to his ear and an expression on his face that Cassian hadn't seen since the last time the northern operation had collapsed under a federal sweep. Cassian said, "Where is everyone?" Purtis held up one finger. "Wait," and Cassian took the phone out of his hand. "Talk to me," he said into the receiver. The voice on the other end belonged to his logistics chief, a compact, humorless man named Breck, who ran the eastern shipping corridor from an office above a restaurant in the port district. Breck said, "The Callaway shipment didn't reach the transfer point. The drivers are not responding. The warehouse at Pier 14 is locked, and I cannot reach anyone who has a key. The relay contact in the Harbor Authority is not picking up." "I've been trying since 4 this morning." Cassian was quiet for 2 seconds. "One shipment." "No," Breck said, "not one shipment. The Callaway manifest, the Drennan containers, and the Voss pallets were all scheduled for overnight transit through the same corridor. None of them moved. The entire eastern corridor went dark sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. Cassian handed the phone back to Purtis. He stood in the hallway and breathed through his nose and ran the list of possibilities in his mind. Rival interference was the first instinct. But a coordinated multi-point shutdown across a single corridor in one night wasn't a rival move. Rivals hit individual targets, created visible damage, sent messages with bodies. This was different. This was like someone had simply reached into the machinery and removed a component that everything else depended on. He called his head of intelligence, straight to voicemail. He called his chief financial officer, picked up on the fourth ring, a voice thick with insufficient sleep. "The offshore accounts," Cassian said, without preamble. A pause. "Too long." "I've been meaning to call you." "Tell me." 3 of the sequestered accounts flagged frozen status overnight. The flags came from inside the clearing system, not from any external pressure. "That means, I know what that means." He hung up. He stood in his hallway at 6:27 in the morning, and the coffee wasn't there, and the staff wasn't there, and 3 offshore accounts had frozen from the inside, which meant someone with internal access codes, codes that fewer than 8 people in the world possessed, had initiated it. He called Vivian. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying that particular brightness she deployed when she was pretending everything was fine. "Good morning. Have you spoken to anyone this morning? From last night?" A beat. "I spoke to Marcus briefly. He wanted to congratulate." "What exactly did Marcus say?" Another beat, slightly longer. Cassian could hear her sitting up, recalibrating. He said congratulations and that he looked forward to working with me. Why? Nothing else? Cashin. Her voice shifted, lower, more careful. What's happening? Stay at the residence. Don't make any calls that aren't to me directly. He paused. And take the necklace off. He hung up before she could respond. What? By 8 o'clock, he was in the war room, a fortified basement office beneath the estate's main structure, insulated, swept for signals weekly, stocked with secure communication equipment that had cost more than some small country's annual intelligence budgets. 3 of his senior captains were already there when he arrived. Breck had come in person. His head of security, a former military contractor named Holst, stood at the far wall with his arms crossed and said nothing. Talk, Cassian said. Breck spread a printed manifest across the table. 6 separate operational nodes went offline between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. Eastern Corridor Shipping, the Fenwick Financial Relay, the private intelligence line that runs through the Callaway network, and the encrypted communication channel we use for the Harbor Authority contacts. He tapped the paper. Each one of these has a separate access architecture. They don't share passwords. They don't share personnel management. They share one thing. Cassian looked at the paper. What? They all run through the same back-channel authorization system. The system that was built about 11 years ago by someone working outside the normal operational structure. Breck looked up at him. Someone who was never formally listed in any of our operational records. The room was quiet. Holst uncrossed his arms. The authorization system has a kill switch function. It was built in from the start. We always knew that. The assumption was that the kill switch required 2-person authentication, the operational lead and the household head. I didn't authorize anything, Cassian said. No, Holst said. You didn't, which means the system has a layer we were never told about. Cassian looked at the table. He looked at the manifest. He thought about last night, the ceremony, the necklace, the way the room had gone silent. Not the silence of shock, the silence of men doing rapid math. He thought about Seraphine walking out of that ballroom without a word. He thought about 18 years. Where is she? He said. Holst said, the secondary residence in the Northern District. She arrived there shortly after midnight. She has not left. She's alone? A pause. She has her usual staff. Her usual staff, Cassian repeated, with a flatness that made Breck look at the wall. He pulled out a chair and sat down, which was something he almost never did in the war room. He sat down, and he looked at the manifest, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time and had no clean name for. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the particular sensation of realizing that the room you thought you'd been standing in was actually a different room entirely and had been for longer than you could immediately calculate. Get me Ferrante, he said. Breck picked up the secure handset, dialed, waited, set the handset down. He's unavailable. Marchetti. Same process, same result. Kael. Also unavailable. Cassian looked at Holst. Holst said nothing, which was its own answer. 3 of the most powerful men he had shared that room with last night. 3 men who had shaken his hand and drunk his wine and sat at his tables for decades, were simultaneously unavailable to his calls at 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning. That had never happened before. Not once. Not even during the worst federal pressure 3 years ago when 2 captains had been arrested and the Western operation had nearly collapsed. Even then, the senior Dons had taken his calls. He said quietly, "Find out who Silas Creed is." The room went very still. Holst said, "Sir?" "You heard me. Silas Creed. I want a full profile on my desk within 3 hours. Background, network connections, current location, and every transaction he's been part of in the last 18 months. Breck and Holst exchanged a look that lasted less than a second. Cassian caught it anyway. "You already know the name." Neither of them answered immediately, which was its own answer. Cassian stood up. "Who is he?" Holst said, "We've had passive intelligence on a Silas Creed for approximately 8 months. He operates as an independent strategic advisor. No fixed organization, no public profile. He has connections across 3 separate criminal networks on the eastern seaboard. He has a particular specialty." He stopped. "Say it." "Transition management. He comes in when a leadership structure is about to change. and he positions himself to benefit from the new structure regardless of which direction the change goes. Holst's jaw tightened slightly. He's very good at identifying which relationships are load-bearing and then finding a way to damage them before anyone realizes what he's doing. Cassian was quiet for a long time. The ventilation system hummed. Someone's phone buzzed on the table and no one looked at it. He got to Vivian, Cassian said. That would be our assessment, yes. How long? Unknown. Minimum 6 months based on what we've been able to observe. 6 months. 6 months during which Vivian had been in his bed, at his table, in his ear, telling him things, specific things, about Seraphine's coldness, her distance, her apparent indifference to the Empire, her secret accounts he didn't have access to, her relationships with men he didn't know. 6 months of carefully constructed information, each piece plausible enough on its own, the cumulative architecture designed to bring him to exactly the moment he had reached last night in that ballroom. He had handed her the necklace. In front of 500 people. He sat back down. Vivian found out about the frozen accounts at 9:15 when she tried to authorize a wire transfer from the household operational account she'd been given access to. A gesture Cassian had made 3 weeks ago. The first concrete sign that he was genuinely moving her toward a formal position. And the system rejected her credentials. She tried twice more. Same result. She called the bank's private client line and gave the account number and the authorization code she'd been provided, and the woman on the other end said, politely and without any particular emotion, that the account had been flagged for administrative review and all access was temporarily suspended pending household authorization. I am the household authorization, Vivian said. I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm showing that primary household authorization credentials are currently flagged as under review. I'd suggest contacting your account manager directly. Vivian hung up. She sat in the living room of the Viscari secondary apartment, a place she'd been staying for 3 weeks, a transitional arrangement that Cassian had framed as temporary while the main estate guest quarters were being renovated, and looked at her phone and felt the first real edge of something cold move through her. She called Silas. He picked up on the first ring. I was expecting to hear from you. The account is frozen, she said. Cassian called me this morning and told me to stay here and not make calls. The necklace, she stopped. He told me to take it off. A pause on the line that lasted slightly too long. Did you? That's your first question? It's relevant. I put it on the table. She looked at the pendant where it sat on the glass coffee table, the black diamond catching the morning light. Silas, what is happening? Yesterday you told me everything was going to go exactly as planned. Last night happened exactly as you said it would. And now this morning, everything is developing as expected, he said, with a smoothness that she had once found reassuring and now found, for the first time, vaguely wrong. There will be turbulence in the first 24 hours. That's the nature of any structural transition. This doesn't feel like turbulence. It feels like what? She looked at the necklace on the table. Like something was already in motion before last night. Like something was waiting. Another pause. Longer this time. Vivian, you need to trust the process. Don't say that to me. Her voice came out harder than she'd intended. I left a very comfortable situation to be part of this. You told me Cassian was going to formalize everything within 72 hours of last night. You told me the senior Dons would fall in line once he made his position public. You told me Seraphine was isolated, politically irrelevant, that her relationships inside the network were ceremonial at best. She stopped. Not one of those things appears to be true this morning. Silas said, Seraphine is more stubborn than anticipated. That's a manageable variable. You said she was irrelevant. I said her formal position was ceremonial. Her informal connections are, a brief pause, calibrating, more extensive than our initial assessment suggested. Vivian stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the city below and pressed her forehead very lightly against the cold glass. You need to tell me everything, right now. Not the version you've been giving me. Everything. This isn't the right channel for that conversation. Then meet me. A pause. Then, Meridian Coffee House, noon. He hung up. Vivian lowered her phone and looked at the necklace on the table. She had wanted it so badly 3 months ago when Silas had first painted the picture for her. The empire, the position, The man who was tired of a cold and distant wife and ready to acknowledge the woman who had actually made him feel alive. It had seemed so clean, so possible, like a story with an obvious ending. She picked up the necklace, turned it over in her hands, felt the weight of it. For the first time, the weight felt like something other than value. Cassian arrived at the Northern District residence at 11 in the morning. He hadn't called ahead. He didn't have a key. He had never had a key, and until this morning, he had never thought to question that. He rang the bell. The door was answered by a woman he didn't recognize, middle-aged, with the precise manner of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had decided in advance how she intended to handle it. "She's in the study," the woman said. He walked through the house and noted, without wanting to, how different it felt from the main estate. Not austere. The main estate was never austere. It was furnished for display. This was different, quieter, books with cracked spines on the shelves. 2 coffee cups on a side table. A coat thrown over the back of a chair in a way that suggested someone had taken it off and not immediately thought about where it landed. A house someone actually lived in. Seraphine was at a desk near the window, reading something on a tablet. She looked up when he came in. She didn't say anything. He closed the door behind him. "The eastern corridor is gone," he said. "I know. 3 offshore accounts are frozen." "I know. Ferrante isn't taking my calls. Marchetti isn't taking my calls. Kyle." "I know, Cassian." He stopped. He looked at her across the room and felt the strange, telescoping sensation of seeing someone he had lived with for 18 years as though she were someone he hadn't met yet. "How long have you been running the back-channel authorization system?" She set the tablet down. "Since the beginning. It was the only way to stabilize the Eastern Corridor relationships long enough for your operational structure to take root. Ferrante wasn't going to hold the compact with you based on your name alone. You were 33 years old. You had your father's reputation and nothing else yet. Someone had to negotiate the terms." She paused. "I negotiated the terms." "You never told me. You never asked what I did with my time." The words were quiet, not accusatory. That was the worst part. She wasn't angry. She was stating a fact the way you state the temperature outside. Observable, measurable, not a matter of opinion. He sat down in the chair across from the desk. "The circle of mothers." Something shifted in her face. Barely perceptible. "Who told you that name?" "Holst has been tracking passive intelligence on something called the Circle of Mothers for about 8 months. They didn't know what it was. They still don't know what it is, except that it appears to have a connection to every major financial and political relationship in our network." He looked at her steadily. "Is it you?" She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, a car moved past on the street below. "It's not me. I'm part of it. There's a difference. The circle was built by a lot of women over a lot of years. Widows of men who were killed in power transitions. Daughters who inherited what their fathers left and had to find a way to protect it without formal status. Financial officers and legal strategists and 3 judges and 2 individuals inside the federal district structure who have had very strong reasons of their own to want stability over chaos." She looked at him levelly. "We don't run the empire, Cassian. We hold the conditions that allow the empire to exist. There is a difference." "And Silas Creed?" Her jaw tightened. It was the first visible crack in her composure since he'd walked in. "Silas Creed has been tracking the circle for approximately 14 months. He doesn't know its full structure. Nobody outside the circle does. But he identified the existence of a back-channel stabilization network, and he understood that the fastest way to destabilize it was to remove its anchor point." She looked at him. "That anchor point is me." The silence in the room was different from the silence in the ballroom last night. That silence had been 500 people doing math. This silence was 2 people looking at the actual shape of 18 years together and seeing it clearly for the first time, which was its own kind of violence. "He used Vivian," Cassian said. "He used your pride," she said quietly. "Vivian was the instrument. Your pride was the lever. He's been working on it for 6 months, building the specific picture of me that would make what you did last night feel not only possible, but justified." Cassian looked at his hands. He had large hands. He had always been aware of that. It was something people noticed about him, something that read as physical authority. Looking at them now, they looked like exactly what they were, a man's hands. Nothing more and nothing less. What happens now? He said. Now, Seraphine said, Silas moves. He has approximately 48 hours before the Dons who were at last night's ceremony complete their own assessment and start reaching out to me formally. He knows that. So his window is exactly that, 48 hours to consolidate something he can use as leverage before the network realigns. What does he want? Control of the Continental Accord. All of it. Not through one household, through a centralized structure with himself at the top. He's been positioning assets inside at least 4 separate families for over a year. She stood up. Last night wasn't about Vivian, and it wasn't about punishing me. It was about cracking the foundation of the Accord at its most visible public moment so that the resulting instability would create an opening. She walked to the window. He almost certainly already has a move prepared for tonight or tomorrow. Cassian said, Then we stop him. Seraphine turned from the window and looked at him with an expression that was very tired and very precise at the same time. Cassian, I have been stopping him, quietly, for 6 weeks. The moves I initiated last night, the corridor shutdown, the account flags, the communication polls, those weren't retaliation against you. They were defensive repositioning to make sure Silas couldn't use the chaos of last night as cover for the first stage of his takeover. He stared at her. You shut down your own operations. I shut down the operations that Silas had already partially infiltrated. Yes. It's better to lose them temporarily than to let him use them. She looked at him steadily. I need you to understand something. The empire you have been running for 18 years is structurally intact. The relationships are intact. The Accord is intact. But Silas has placed assets in positions that I have not been able to fully map yet, and if he moves before I finish the mapping, there will be violence at a scale that none of the families are prepared for. She paused. I need you to do something very difficult. What? I need you to do nothing. For the next 24 hours, make no calls, issue no orders, contact no one. Let the silence speak. He looked at her for a long time. The study was warm. Somewhere in the house, something, a clock, a timer, ticked with the quiet patience of a thing that had been running on its own for a long time. And if I can't do that, he said, then people will die, she said simply, and it won't be Silas's people. He stood up. He looked at the window she'd been standing at. He looked at the books on the shelves. He looked at the 2 coffee cups on the side table, and he thought about the kitchen at the main estate this morning, and the empty counter, and the cold coffee maker. He nodded, once. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. The necklace. Leave it, she said. He left. At 12:04, Vivian walked into the Meridian Coffee House and found Silas Creed already seated at the corner table he always chose, back to the wall, sightline to both exits, with an espresso in front of him and the particular look of a man who had decided in advance how the conversation was going to go. She sat down across from him without taking off her coat. Tell me the truth, she said. He looked at her with the careful warmth he had been deploying since the first time they'd met, 14 months ago, at a gallery opening she'd only attended because a friend had dragged her there, and she recognized it now for what it was. A performance. A very good performance, calibrated specifically to her, but a performance. I always tell you the truth, he said. Then tell me this. She leaned forward. Was I ever going to actually run anything? Or was last night purely about removing Seraphine from the room? He smiled. It was the wrong smile, too fast, too easy. The smile of a man who had been caught but was deciding whether to admit it. You can run things, Vivian. Once the transition is complete, what transition? Her voice dropped. There is no transition happening. The accounts are frozen. The shipping is down. Cassian is panicking. The Dons aren't picking up his calls. Nothing you described is what's actually happening. The first 24 hours are always unstable. Stop saying that. She put both hands flat on the table. I have been in this life long enough to know what instability looks like. This doesn't look like instability. This looks like someone pulling the floor out from under us in a very specific, very deliberate sequence. She looked at him. Did Seraphine know before last night? Silas was quiet for a beat too long. Did she know? Vivian said again, harder. She is more aware of the network's architecture than I initially assessed, he said. Yes. You told me she was isolated, ceremonial, that her relationships were social, not operational. I told you what the intelligence suggested at the time. You told me what you needed me to believe. She stood up. Her chair scraped back against the floor. You used me to get Cassian to humiliate her publicly because you needed the accord destabilized, and you needed it to happen in a way that couldn't be traced back to you directly. Her voice was low and absolutely even. And when this goes wrong, and it is going wrong, I can feel it going wrong right now. I'm the one who's standing in the middle of it with a necklace around my neck and no cover. Silas looked up at her. For the first time since she'd known him, the warmth in his face was entirely gone. What was underneath it was something cleaner and considerably colder. Sit down, he said. No. Vivian. His voice was very quiet. Sit down. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she turned and walked out of the coffee house, and she was already reaching for her phone before she hit the door. And her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady, because she had already made the call she needed to make. Not to Cassian, to Seraphine. The message she'd sent at 11:58 that morning, before she'd even walked into the coffee house, had been 6 words. I know what he's actually planning. And Seraphine had responded in under a minute. I know you do. Come in. The point of no return had already arrived, and not one person in that coffee house, not Silas Creed with his back to the wall and his sight line to both exits, had seen it coming. Vivian arrived at the Northern District residence at 12:47 in the afternoon. Rissa answered the door the same way she had answered it for Cassian that morning, with the precise manner of someone who had been expecting exactly this visitor and had decided in advance exactly how much warmth to extend, which, in Vivian's case, was functional but not warm. She was shown into a sitting room off the main hallway, not the study. That distinction was deliberate, and Vivian understood it immediately. The study was where Seraphine worked. The sitting room was where she received people whose status in the household was still being determined. Vivian sat down. She did not take off her coat. Seraphine came in 3 minutes later. She was wearing the same gray she'd had on the night before, or something close enough to it that Vivian couldn't be certain. No jewelry. Her hair still pinned at the back of her neck. She looked, impossibly, like someone who had slept well, which Vivian was fairly certain was not true, and was instead simply the particular discipline of a woman who had decided years ago that she would never let exhaustion be visible on her face. She sat down across from Vivian and looked at her with an expression that was not hostile and was not warm. It was assessing. The way a surgeon looks at a scan before deciding where to cut. You said you know what he's actually planning, Seraphine said. No preamble. No acknowledgement of the previous night, of the necklace, of any of it. Vivian appreciated that more than she expected to. He has a package, she said. Documentation, financial records, communications intercepts, operational logs. He's been assembling it for over a year. He told me it was leverage, insurance against the senior Dons if they refused to recognize the transition after last night. Seraphine's expression didn't change. What kind of documentation? Records linking each of the major families to specific federal violations. Not general, specific. Named agents, named informants, dates, amounts. The kind of material that if it reached the right prosecutors would result in indictments across every family represented at the summit. Vivian watched Seraphine's face carefully. He said it was a deterrent, that he'd never actually use it, that the existence of it was enough to ensure cooperation. He told you that? Yes. And you believed him? A pause. At the time. Vivian looked at her hands. I'm not stupid, Mrs. Viscari. I knew what I was involved in. I knew Silas was using me as part of a strategy. I thought I understood the strategy. I thought I was a participant in it, not... She stopped. Not the disposable part, Seraphine finished. The words were quiet. Not cruel. Just accurate. Vivian looked up. The package isn't leverage, is it? Seraphine said. Where is it? I don't know the physical location. He keeps it, the master copy, the one with full verification, in a place he's never told me directly. But I know it exists because I've seen extracts from it. He showed me 3 specific documents 8 months ago to demonstrate he was serious, to demonstrate he had real power. She paused. One of the documents was about your husband. The room was very still. Tell me, Seraphine said. Vivian reached into the interior pocket of her coat and removed a folded piece of paper. She set it on the table between them. I photographed it when he wasn't in the room. I've been carrying it for 8 months. I didn't know why I kept it. I think I knew somewhere that I might need it. Seraphine picked up the paper. She unfolded it. She read it. Her face did not change. That was the thing that scared Vivian more than any visible reaction would have. The absolute trained stillness of a woman reading something that should have broken her open and instead simply settling deeper into whatever place she kept the things she couldn't afford to feel right now. She folded the paper. She set it on the table. She looked at the wall for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "How long have you known about this specific document?" 8 months, I told you. And you didn't tell Cassian. Silas told me it was fabricated, that he'd had it constructed to use as a pressure point specifically against Cassian if he resisted the transition. He said it wasn't real. She paused. I believe that too. Seraphine looked at her. It's not fabricated. The sitting room felt smaller suddenly. The light from the window was the same light it had been 30 seconds ago, but Vivian felt it differently now, coming from a different angle, illuminating something it hadn't been illuminating before. What's on that document, Vivian said carefully, is real. Yes. Cassian actually, yes. Seraphine's voice was even, just barely. 4 years ago. A negotiation that went wrong in a way he never told me about. A decision he made in the space of about 40 minutes that he has been carrying ever since, and that I have spent 3 years quietly containing the fallout from without ever telling him I knew. She picked up the paper again, looked at it. He doesn't know I know. And Silas has had this for over a year. Vivian said he was never going to use it as leverage against the families. No. I was going to use it against Cassian directly. To force Cassian to step aside and endorse the consolidation or watch the documentation go to federal investigators. Vivian pressed her fingers against her temple. And if I hadn't come here, he would have moved on Cassian within the next 12 hours. Tonight, most likely. After the shipping disruptions created enough visible chaos that a sudden leadership transition would read as stabilization rather than takeover. Seraphine set the paper down. He needed me removed from the room first. That was last night. He needed Cassian isolated from the senior dons. That was this morning. The next step was always Cassian directly. Vivian stared at her. He told me I was going to run things. Seraphine looked at her with something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, and landed somewhere more complicated than either. You were going to be the face, she said, a visible, recognizable Donna figure that the public elements of the operation could be organized around, while Silas controlled every actual mechanism from behind a position with no formal name and no formal accountability. She paused. You would have had the title and the exposure and none of the actual power, and the moment you became inconvenient, you would have disappeared. The documentation package alone would have been enough to ensure that anyone who asked questions about the transition, including you, could be silenced by threatening to release it. Vivian was quiet for a long time. The coat she hadn't taken off felt heavy now, like something she'd been carrying without realizing the weight of it. What do we do? She said. Seraphine stood up. First, you tell me everything. Every meeting, every location, every name he mentioned, every asset he referenced. Everything. She looked at Vivian with an expression that had moved past the assessing stage into something more direct. And then we move fast, because Silas is going to realize within the next 2 hours that you didn't come back from that coffee house. And when he does, the timeline compresses significantly. The debrief took 94 minutes. Risa sat in the corner of the study with a tablet, documenting. Seraphine asked questions in a sequence that felt to Vivian less like a conversation and more like surgical extraction. Not cruel, but absolutely precise. Each question designed to open exactly the area she needed access to and no other. Names, locations, dates, the specific language Silas had used in specific conversations, the places he'd been careful, and the places where the carefulness had slipped. By the time Vivian had exhausted everything she could remember, her throat was dry, and there were 4 empty water glasses on the desk, and the afternoon light through the window had shifted by nearly 2 hours. Seraphine looked at the notes on her own tablet. She was quiet for a long time. The archive, she said finally. Not to Vivian, to Risa. Risa said, "It's ready." Vivian said, "What archive?" Seraphine looked at her. In the basement of the main Vescari estate, there is a room that Cassian has never been in. It was sealed in the original construction. The architectural records list it as a Foundation service space. It is not a Foundation service space. She paused. It contains the complete records of the Continental Accord, the original documents, the founding blood oath instruments, and a specific archive of every negotiation, agreement, and covenant that has been conducted under the Accord for the past 6 decades. She set the tablet down. Including the specific covenant that defines what the Donna Necklace actually is and what its placement signifies under the terms of the original compact. Vivian said, "You have the original documents." The Circle has always held the original documents. That's one of its functions. The physical security of the institutional memory of the Accord. She looked at Vivian steadily. What Cassian did last night, placing the necklace on you. Under the original terms of the compact, that act has a specific legal meaning within the Accord's own governance structure. It isn't simply symbolic, it's a formal declaration. And a formal declaration made incorrectly, without the consent of the Circle's council, is not merely disrespectful, it's a breach of covenant. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning every family at that summit who is bound by the original compact has standing to call an emergency session. Meaning the Accord's own enforcement mechanisms, which predate any of the current families by at least 2 generations, can be activated. She picked up the paper Vivian had brought and looked at it one more time. And meaning that when I present the original covenant documents alongside this, Silas Creed loses the only thing he has been relying on the entire time. Which is? The assumption that I have no formal standing to act. Seraphine's voice was very level. He believed that removing me from the ceremonial position removed me from any legitimate authority. He doesn't know about the archive. He doesn't know about the covenant instruments. He doesn't know that the Donna of the Continental Accord has never derived her authority from her husband's recognition. She looked at Vivian. He built his entire plan on a misunderstanding of where the power actually lives. Vivian looked at her for a long moment. "You've been waiting for him." Seraphine said nothing, which was its own answer. At 3:15 in the afternoon, the message came through on Holst's secure line at the main estate. He read it twice. Then he walked directly to the room where Cassian had been sitting for the past 4 hours, doing exactly what Seraphine had asked him to do. Nothing. It was, by all visible evidence, one of the hardest things Cassian Vescari had ever done. He was sitting in the chair by the window with a glass of water he hadn't touched, and the particular tightly controlled stillness of a man holding himself back from every instinct he had. Holst said, "There's a problem." Cassian looked up. "One of our captains, Reeves, Eastern Sector, made contact with Silas Creed's network this morning. The contact was initiated by Reeves, not by them." Holst's voice was flat, professional. "We've been looking at his communications history for the past 2 hours. The contact this morning wasn't the first one." Cassian said, "How long?" 11 months. The glass of water stayed on the armrest where it had been. Cassian didn't throw it, didn't stand up. The stillness became something denser, more deliberate. What did he give them? Movement schedules, operational timing, and Holst stopped. "Say it." "The access protocol for the Eastern Corridor Authorization System, the one we discussed this morning, the back channel." He paused. Reeves had access to it because he managed 3 of the Eastern Corridor nodes. He passed the protocol architecture to Creed's people 10 months ago. Cassian said, "Silas has had the back channel access architecture for 10 months. "Yes." "Which means when Seraphine initiated the shutdown last night, he already knew the shutdown was coming." Holst said nothing. He let her shut it down. Cassian stood up now, slowly, the way a very large structure shifts when its foundation moves. He let her pull the Eastern Corridor because he wanted it pulled. He wanted the disruption. He wanted the chaos of the first morning to look like the consequence of her action, not his. He walked to the window, looked out. "Reeves. He's in custody. Our people have him in the sublevel. Does Seraphine know?" "I called her line 7 minutes ago. No answer." Holst paused. "There's something else." Cassian turned from the window. "The documentation package that Creed has been assembling. Holst held his tablet so Cassian could see the screen. We pulled a partial inventory from Reeves's communications. The package is more extensive than we believed. It doesn't just cover the family operations. It includes... He stopped again. He was a man who had delivered bad news to dangerous people for 20 years, and he still stopped. What does it include? Cassian said. The circle of mothers, specific members, specific transactions, meeting locations. Holst lowered the tablet. He has 12 names. Of the 40-odd people who make up the Circle's active council, he has identified 12 by name with documentation sufficient for criminal indictment. He paused. Including Risa Venn. Cassian stared at him. Risa is part of the Circle. Risa has been part of the Circle for 16 years. She's one of its founding members. Holst said it carefully, like a man aware he was handing someone an explosive. She's also the person who currently has access to the archive beneath this estate. Cassian moved before Holst finished the sentence. Through the door, down the hallway, to the basement stairwell. He hit the light switch. The stairs went down into the dim, and at the bottom, where the Foundation service corridor turned left and then right, and then opened into what the architectural records called a utility access space. The door was open. Not broken open. Not forced. Open, swung back on its hinges, the interior lights on. The motion sensor system that should have triggered an alarm sitting dark and deactivated on the wall mount. He walked in. The archive was intact. The shelves of document cases, the sealed containers, the indexed records, all of it present. He scanned the room. Nothing visibly removed. But on the central reading table, where no document had ever been left out in the 12 years since this room had been finished and sealed, there was a single file folder. He crossed the room and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A document he recognized. Not the content, he'd never seen this specific document, but the format. The paper stock, the embossed seal at the top, the handwritten notations in the margin. The Continental Accord's own record style, unchanged since the original instruments were drawn. He read it. He read it again. He set it down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the surface and breathed. The document was a covenant record from 19 years ago, the year before his father died, the year before Cassian had formally assumed leadership of the Vescari household, the year he had married Seraphine Arden, whom he had known for 8 months and whose family background he had understood to be modest, and whose apparent lack of connections to any organized network had been something he'd considered, at the time, an asset. The covenant record indicated that Seraphine Arden had been formally recognized by the Circle of Mothers as the designated Donna of the Continental Accord, 14 months before Cassian had met her. She had not come into his life by accident. She had been placed. He called her on the direct line. She picked up on the second ring. "You were assigned to me," he said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. Barely. A pause. Long enough that he knew she'd been anticipating this call. That's one way to describe it. What's another way? The Circle identified the Vescari succession as the highest risk transition point in the Accord's stability for that decade. Your father had 3 potential successors, and the other 2 were going to tear the Eastern Compact apart inside of 18 months. You were the only viable option, but you were young and untested, and Ferrante was not going to extend the compact to an untested 22-year-old without significant relationship assurance. A pause. I was the relationship assurance. You married me as a strategic placement. I was introduced to you as a strategic placement. What happened after that was... She stopped. He heard her breathe. It became something else. You know that. Do I? He looked at the document on the table. 19 years, Seraphine. Yes. You have been inside my household, inside my life, inside everything I have built for 19 years, and you have never once told me the truth about what you are. The silence on the line was different from the silences earlier in the day. It had weight to it, the weight of something that had been carefully held for a very long time and was now, finally, too heavy to hold the same way. No, she said quietly. I haven't. He picked up the document, set it down. Silas left this for me to find. He deactivated the archive door sensor and left this specific document on the table. A beat. Then, what? The document detailing your original placement. He left it here. He heard the change in her breathing, sharp, controlled, but changed. He knew about the archive. That's not... She stopped. He heard her moving, the sound of a chair, a door. That's not possible. The archive location? He knew, Seraphine. The steadiness in his voice cost him something, but he maintained it. He's had a source inside this estate for 11 months. Reeves. But Reeves didn't know about the archive. Reeves didn't have access to this level. He looked around the room. The intact shelves, the deactivated sensor, the perfectly placed document. Someone else let him in here. Someone who knew the layout and knew where to find this specific record among everything in this room. He paused. Someone who has been inside the circle for 16 years. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Risa, Seraphine said. The word came out as barely a sound. She's been working for him, Cassian said. She's been inside your circle, inside your most protected operation, for however long Creed has been building this. And she chose what he needed, and she left it where I would find it, because the one thing that could still derail your plan to counter him is me not trusting you. He heard Seraphine on the other end of the line. He heard the exact sound of someone absorbing a betrayal that had come from a direction they had never once looked for it. Not a gasp, not a sob, but a specific quality of silence that was its own kind of sound. The sound of 19 years of trust, rewriting itself in real time. "Where's Risa now?" she said. Her voice had gone very flat. "I don't know. She left the northern residence before I called you. She knew we'd make the connection." He paused. Seraphine. The 12 names he has in the documentation package. Holst gave me the list. Risa is one of them. But it's not incriminating documentation he has on her. It's payment records. Another silence. "She's been paid," Seraphine said, "for 14 months. The flat voice became something colder and more absolute. He has 12 names from the circle. If he has been receiving active intelligence from inside the council for 14 months, then he knows the archive exists. He knows the Covenant instruments. He knows the emergency session mechanism. He knows everything you were planning to use against him," Cassian said. "Yes. Which means the counteroffensive you've been building. He knows about it. He's been watching it develop." She was quiet for 1 second. "He let me build it. He let me believe I was ahead of him. He let me feel like the architecture of his plan was something I understood and could counter." Her voice dropped further. "He built a second layer underneath everything I was doing, and he has been operating in it for over a year, and I—" She stopped. Cassian said nothing. "I didn't see it," she said. And the 3 words carried the full weight of what they meant. Not just the tactical failure, not just the intelligence gap, but the deeper thing. Risa. 16 years. The person who had sat across the kitchen table and said he really did it, and poured 2 cups of tea and asked the right questions in exactly the right order. "Tell me what you need," Cassian said. "I need to think." "We don't have time to—" Voice cut through. "Give me 2 minutes." He waited. Outside the archive room, the basement was quiet. The estate above him was going about whatever version of normal the day had managed to produce. Somewhere in the city, Silas Creed was aware that Vivian had not come back, aware that the timeline had moved, aware that his source inside the circle had almost certainly now been identified, and therefore aware that the window he had been managing so carefully for 14 months had just become something he couldn't control, which meant he would move tonight, not tomorrow, tonight. Seraphine came back on the line. 2 minutes exactly. "The emergency session," she said. "The Covenant mechanism that allows the circle to call an accord session. Silas knows about it. But there's a part of the Covenant instruments he doesn't have access to. A codicil. Added 40 years ago, long before his intelligence network existed." Her voice was steadier now. Not the steadiness of someone who was fine, the steadiness of someone who had decided what they were going to do next, regardless of how they felt. "The codicil specifies that in the event of a verified breach of Covenant, accompanied by active threat to the Accord's physical archive, the Donna has the right to call an immediate emergency assembly, not through the Circle's normal channels, directly. Her authority alone. What does that mean in practice? It means I can summon every Don who was at that summit to a location of my choosing within 48 hours, and they are Covenant-bound to come." She paused. "And it means that whatever Silas has planned for tonight, if I invoke the codicil first, he walks into a room where every person he needs to neutralize is already assembled and already aligned against him." Cassian looked at the document on the table, at the seal at the top, At the handwritten notations in the margin that he now understood, reading them differently, were his wife's handwriting 19 years younger. "You'd be exposing everything," he said. "The circle, the archive, all of it." "Yes." "The families will know what you've been doing for 20 years. "Yes." "Some of them won't like it." "No, they won't." Her voice was very quiet. "But all of them will understand it, because every single one of them has benefited from it, whether they knew it or not. And because the alternative, letting Silas walk away from this with any leverage intact, means nobody in that network is safe. Not the families, not the circle, not you." A pause. "Not anyone." Cashin looked at the room. The shelves, the decades of accumulated institutional memory stacked in labeled containers along 3 walls. The weight of it. The scale of what she had been carrying, quietly, underneath everything he had thought he was building. He picked up the document from the table. He folded it. He put it in his jacket pocket. "When do we move?" he said. "Now," Seraphine said. "We move now." The invocation went out at 4:17 in the afternoon, not through phones, not through the secure communication lines that Silas had spent 14 months infiltrating and mapping. Through the original channel, the one that predated every modern encryption system by 40 years, the one that ran through a network of personal couriers, each carrying a single sealed envelope with a single embossed mark on the flap that every Don who had ever been bound by the Continental Accord had been taught, by their fathers and their fathers' fathers, to recognize on sight. Seraphine wrote the summons by hand, 12 copies. The same language in each, the formal covenant phrasing that hadn't been used since the last emergency session 3 decades ago, before any of the current generation of Dons had taken their positions. Risa would have known where the blank covenant paper was stored. Risa would have given Silas that information along with everything else. So Seraphine used her own stationery, plain paper, personal seal. The codicil didn't specify the paper stock. She handed the envelopes to 12 individuals who were not Circle members, not Viscari household staff, not anyone whose name appeared in any intelligence file Silas Creed had ever compiled. She handed them to 12 people who owed her debts that had nothing to do with the criminal network: a hospital administrator, a retired school teacher, a woman who ran a dry cleaning business 3 blocks from the Meridian Grand, and 9 others like them. People who existed in the complete blind spot of every criminal intelligence operation because they had never done anything that anyone in that world would have considered worth watching. Each courier had a single destination and a single instruction: hand deliver, wait for acknowledgement, return. By 5:40, 11 acknowledgements had come back. The 12th came at 6:03. Ferrante's personal confirmation, written in the old man's own hand: "We will be there, every one of us." Seraphine set the last envelope down and looked at the wall and let herself feel, for exactly 4 seconds, the particular relief of a mechanism working the way it was designed to work after a very long period of not being certain it still could. Then she stood up, because there was no more time for 4-second pauses. The location she had chosen was not the Meridian Grand, not any venue Silas knew about. It was a building in the southern district that appeared in no record connected to the Vescari household or the Circle of Mothers, a converted warehouse that had been quietly purchased through a 7-layer holding structure by a financial entity whose paper trail ended in a jurisdiction that did not share records with anyone. The building had been prepared for exactly this contingency 18 months ago, when Seraphine had first become aware that something was moving in the network's periphery. Prepared and then left ready, the way you leave a fire extinguisher on a wall, hoping you never need it, making certain it works if you do. Cassian arrived there at 7:10 with Holst and 4 men whose specific skills ran toward the physical rather than the administrative. He walked the perimeter first. Old habit. He walked it without being asked and without explaining why, and Seraphine watched him do it from the interior doorway and felt something complicated move through her chest that she did not examine. She had things to examine later, not now. "The session starts at 9, she said when he came back inside. "The Dons will arrive between 8:30 and 8:50. I want everyone in position before 8. Cassian looked at the room, the central table, the chairs arranged in the formal, compact configuration she had set up with 2 of the remaining people she trusted. Absolutely. The document cases stacked at the head of the table, the secondary exits she had marked, and the sight lines she had cleared. Where do you want me? Beside me. She said it without hesitation. Then, after a beat, if you're willing. He looked at her. The question between them was not about the seating arrangement, and both of them knew it. It was about the document in his jacket pocket. It was about 19 years and the specific truth she had never told him, and the specific truth that didn't change anything about what had actually passed between them and yet changed everything about its shape. He said, "I'm willing." She nodded, turned back to the table. Silas Creed found out about the invocation at 6:58. The information came from Risa, who had been monitoring Seraphine's communications from a distance since her departure from the northern residence. But even Risa's access had limits. She knew an invocation had gone out, knew the general mechanism, could not identify the location. He sat with this information in a rented room above a dry goods store in the Eastern District, and he turned it over in his mind, the way a man turns over a stone. He expected to find something under, and instead finds only more ground. The codicil. He had known about the covenant mechanisms. Risa had given him the overview 14 months ago, enough to understand the Circle's emergency session authority, enough to plan around the normal channels. What he had not known about, because Risa had not known about it, because the codicil had been added in the years before Risa joined the Circle, in the years when the current council's senior members had still been junior, and its existence had been held by only 3 people, one of whom was now dead, was the direct Donna invocation authority. He stood up, walked to the window, looked at the street below. He had 14 months of preparation. He had 12 names from the Circle with documentation sufficient to ensure silence. He had the package, the full package, the material that would put Cassian Viscari in a federal holding facility within 72 hours of its release and destabilize the Viscari household beyond recovery. He had assets inside 3 separate family operations who were positioned to support a leadership transition. He had Reeves, who was, he checked his phone, currently not responding. He stared at the phone. Reeves had been his primary internal asset at the Vescari estate. Reeves had been the one who accessed the archive door sensor. Reeves had been the one who placed the document on the table, following the specific instructions Silas had given him 3 days ago, timed for exactly this morning. If Reeves was not responding, Reeves was in custody, which meant Cassian had the document, and Cassian had made the connection, and Cassian had called Seraphine. And instead of the paralysis that the document was supposed to produce, the fracture between husband and wife, the trust collapse, the 48 hours of internal chaos that Silas needed, the opposite had happened. They were moving together. He picked up the phone and made 3 calls in rapid sequence. The first confirmed that his assets inside the Marchetti operation were still in position. The second confirmed that the documentation package was secure in its physical location, a safe deposit box in a private vault in the financial district, accessible only to him, the kind of storage that required his physical presence and biometric confirmation to open. The third call reached a man named Crow, who handled the specific category of problem that couldn't be solved through negotiation or documentation. "The session location," Silas said. "I need it in the next 45 minutes. Crow said, "That's tight." "I know it's tight." "What do you need at the location?" Silas looked out the window at the street, at the dry goods store across the road, at the ordinary and different city going about its evening. "Enough to stop it before it starts," he said. Cassian felt it at 8:17, not heard, felt. The particular shift in the air pressure of a building when something changes outside its walls. A change in the pattern of sound, in the quality of the light through the high windows. He'd spent enough time in enough rooms where violence was imminent to know the feeling in his body before his mind caught up with it. He was on his feet before he fully understood why. "Holst," he said. Holst was already moving toward the secondary exit on the east wall. 2 of the other men went to the west side. The remaining 2 stayed at the main door. Seraphine looked at Cassian across the table. "How many?" "I don't know yet." He moved toward her. "Get to the center of the room." "I'm not—" "Seraphine." His voice came out hard, not angry, urgent. "The center of the room, now!" She moved. Not because she was told to. The expression on her face made clear she was weighing the tactical logic and arriving at the same conclusion independently. She moved to the center, and she took the document cases off the table and held them against her chest, and she looked at the doors the way she'd looked at Cassian in the ballroom the previous night, with absolute stillness that was its own form of readiness. The east door came open first, not broken, opened with a key, which meant Silas had someone who'd had access to this building, which meant the 7-layer holding structure had a layer Seraphine hadn't accounted for, which meant Risa's access to her personal records had gone deeper than she'd understood. 3 men came through the east door. Professional movement, economical, the kind that meant specific training. Holst met the first one before he'd cleared the door frame, and the sound of that collision was brief and ugly, and the man went down. But there were 2 more, and Holst had one hand that wasn't working properly from the impact. Cassian moved. He was across the room in the time it took the second man to register. There was someone coming at him, and the collision wasn't elegant. There was nothing elegant about it. It was 2 large men making contact at velocity, and the force of it carried both of them into the wall, and Cassian felt something in his left shoulder give in a way that sent white pain down his arm, and he filed that away because there was no time for it yet. The third man got past both of them. He was halfway to Seraphine when Vivian stepped out from behind the document shelving along the south wall. Vivian, who had been in this building since 7:30, who had said nothing about being in this building, who had apparently made a decision about which side of this she was on, and had been sitting with that decision quietly in the dark for 45 minutes, and hit the third man across the back of the knee with a length of steel conduit she must have found in the building's utility closet. He went down hard. She stood over him with the conduit in both hands, and she was breathing in sharp pulls, and her face had an expression on it that had nothing to do with the woman who had been decorating Cassian's arm at the summit the night before. Cassian looked at her from across the room. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. The west door held. The main door held. The 3 men from the east door were on the floor. Holst came back to the center of the room with his right hand pressed against his left forearm and his face absolutely neutral in the way of someone managing significant pain with the specific discipline of someone who had been managing significant pain professionally for a long time. Seraphine said, "Are you?" "I'm functional," Holst said, which was not the same thing as fine, but it was the only answer the situation had room for. Outside car engines, multiple, arriving. But the pattern was wrong for a second wave of Silas's people. Too many vehicles, 2 spread across the building perimeter. 2. Cassian recognized the distribution. He'd used it himself. It was a containment pattern. The Dons were arriving. They came in through the main entrance in groups of 2 and 3, preceded each time by a single advance man who swept the space with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing exactly this for decades. Ferrante came forth, moving more slowly than he had at the summit the night before, leaning slightly on a cane he hadn't had the previous evening. The cold affected his hip, and the evening had turned cold. He looked at the 3 men on the floor without particular surprise. He looked at Vivian with the conduit still in her hand. He looked at Cassian's shoulder. He looked at Seraphine standing in the center of the room with the document cases held against her chest. He said, "We got here as fast as we could." Seraphine said, "You got here in time." He nodded. Moved to his seat at the table. By 8:44, 11 of the 12 summoned Dons were seated. The 12th arrived at 8:49, slightly breathless, with a cut on his left hand from what appeared to be broken glass, and an explanation he delivered in 2 sentences that indicated Silas's people had tried to intercept him at his vehicle and that he had resolved the situation in a manner that would require some administrative attention tomorrow, but had not prevented his attendance tonight. He sat down. Seraphine set the document cases on the table. She looked at the assembled room. 11 of the most powerful men in the American criminal network. The men who had watched her husband put a necklace on another woman's throat less than 24 hours ago. The men who had lowered their eyes toward her in the silence afterward. The men who were here now because a piece of paper she had written by hand and sent by courier had asked them to come. She opened the first document case. "The Continental Accord was established," she said, and her voice in the room was steady and clear and carried without effort, "on the principle that lasting power requires institutional memory. Not just force, not just money, memory. The knowledge of what was agreed, by whom, under what terms, and why." She lifted the first document from the case, the founding instrument, the original compact, the paper old enough that it was kept in a preservation sleeve. Every family represented in this room has a signatory in this document. Every one of you inherited an obligation that predates the current generation by more than a century. She set it on the table. Last night, that covenant was breached. Not symbolically, formally. Under the specific terms of Article 7 of the original compact, an improper placement of the Donna designation constitutes a breach of covenant, activating the emergency session protocol. She paused. That is why you are here. Ferrante said, "We know why we're here, Seraphine." "I know you do." She met his eyes. "I'm saying it for the record, because the record matters. Because in 20 years, when someone tries to rewrite what happened in this room tonight, the record will be what survives." She opened the second document case. Silas Creed has been operating inside this network for 14 months with the specific purpose of destabilizing the Accord and establishing centralized control under his own authority. He has documentation, financial records, communications intercepts, operational materials that he has used as leverage to ensure cooperation and silence from individuals inside your families and inside the circle. She began placing documents on the table, one at a time, in a sequence that told its own story. I have the counter documentation. Every piece of material he holds, I have the context for. The full context. What those records actually represent, how they were obtained, what he did to the people involved to obtain them. She looked around the table. He has fragments. I have the complete architecture. One of the Dons, younger than the others, second generation, a man named Prescott, who had inherited his family's position 18 months ago and was still finding his footing, said, "Where is Creed now?" Cassian said from his position beside Seraphine, "He knows the session is happening. He doesn't know the location. He sent a team here at 8:15. He paused. They didn't reach the room. Prescott looked at the three men still on the floor along the east wall, now zip-tied and very quiet. He looked at Holst's arm. He looked at Vivian, who had set the conduit down and was standing against the south wall with her arms crossed, and an expression that had settled into something that looked like the particular aftermath of an adrenaline decision. Not regret, but the recalibration of someone discovering what they were actually capable of. Prescott said, "Oh, all right." Marchetti Elder leaned forward. "The documentation package, the material he's holding, where is it physically?" "Private vault in the financial district," Seraphine said. "Biometric access, his credentials only. We can't reach it without him." She paused. "We don't need to." The table looked at her. "If every family represented in this room formally, on the record, in covenant session, acknowledges awareness of the material Creed holds and preemptively validates the context of documentation I'm presenting tonight, the leverage disappears." She looked at each of them in turn. "He has power over you because you're afraid of what those records would do if released in isolation, without context, to prosecutors who don't know the full picture. If the full picture exists on the record, ratified by this session, the isolation disappears. The material becomes what it actually is, selectively edited fragments. And the people he intended to use it against can defend themselves." The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a large number of very smart people are arriving at the same conclusion simultaneously. Ferrante said, "You're asking us to put our family's business formally on record in a covenant session." "I'm asking you to trust the covenant over Silas Creed," Seraphine said. "Yes." Another silence. Ferrante looked at Cassian. "Your wife," he said, with an inflection that carried about 11 distinct meanings simultaneously. Cassian said, "I know." "Do you?" "I'm learning." Ferrante looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Seraphine. He picked up a pen from the table, his own pen, the one he always carried, a habit Seraphine knew about because she had noticed it at every summit for 18 years, and he set it on the first document she had laid on the table. "Where do I sign?" he said. It was Prescott who saw the light change. He was the youngest in the room, which meant his eyes were still fast, still catching things that older, more settled attention missed. He saw the light under the main door shift, the particular shift of a shadow passing outside. Not a single person, multiple people, moving in coordinated sequence. And he was already pushing back from the table when the door came in. Not with a key this time. With force. 4 men. The first 2 were through the gap before Holst people could close the distance, and the room erupted into the specific controlled chaos of a space that had been prepared for exactly this and was now living it. Tables shoved, chairs back. The Dons moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had survived long enough to lead by understanding, viscerally, when a room had turned lethal. Cassian was moving before he registered the decision to move. His left shoulder was wrong. The something that had given in the earlier collision had stiffened in the intervening hour, and the arm wasn't working the way it was supposed to. And the first man he reached hit him on that side before Cassian could fully adjust, and the pain that went through him was the particular clarifying pain of an injury being pushed past its limit, white and total and briefly blinding. He stayed on his feet. The second man came at the table where the documents were. Seraphine pulled the cases back and to the side with both arms and took the impact of the man's forearm across her upper body without going down, which surprised him enough that she was able to put her elbow into the space below his ribs with enough force that he lost his air and his focus simultaneously. She stayed on her feet. Vivian, from across the room, said, "Cassian, left." He turned left. Silas Creed stood in the doorway. Not one of his men, Silas himself. He was not a large man, medium height, medium build, the kind of physical presence that read as negligible right up until the moment he decided it shouldn't. He was wearing a dark jacket and his hands were at his sides, and he looked at the room, the Dons, the documents on the table, the men he'd sent in who were not presently winning, with the expression of a man recalculating in real time. His right hand came up. He was holding a gun. He pointed it at Seraphine. The room went very still. The men fighting stopped. Not because anyone ordered it, because the threat was clear enough that every nervous system in the space registered it simultaneously and made the same immediate calculation. Silas said, "The documents." Seraphine looked at him. She had the document cases in her arms, held against her chest, and she looked at Silas Creed over the top of them, with the same expression she had worn in the ballroom the previous night when Cassian had walked past her with the necklace. Absolute trained stillness. "No," she said. "Seraphine." His voice was quiet, almost conversational. "I have spent 14 months on this. I have spent 14 months managing every variable, repositioning every relationship, building every piece of what I needed to make this work. And it has worked. Every part of it has worked. Reeves gave me what I needed. Risa gave me what I needed. Vivian gave me what I needed. Your husband's pride gave me what I needed." He looked at her steadily. "The one thing I didn't fully account for was the codicil. That's all. One missed detail. I can work with where we are." "You can't," Seraphine said. "The documents. Set them on the table. There are 11 Dons in this room who have already seen what's in those cases. Shooting me doesn't change what they've seen." "No," Silas said. "But it changes what they're willing to say they've seen." He looked around the table at the assembled Dons with the particular cold clarity of someone who had been studying the specific fears of specific people for a very long time. "You've been in this room for 30 minutes. You haven't signed anything yet. You haven't formally ratified anything. As far as any external record is concerned, this session hasn't happened. And if the person who called the session is no longer able to confirm it occurred," the gunshot was very loud in the enclosed space. But it wasn't Silas's gun. Cassian had moved the moment Silas's attention had shifted to the table, the moment between the word occurred and whatever came next. Crossed the distance between them in the time it took Silas to register the movement, and the gun went off because Silas's hand contracted on the trigger when Cassian's body hit his, and the shot went wide and high and punched through the wall above the east door. And then they were both on the floor, and Cassian's bad shoulder was screaming, and Silas had lost the gun, but had not lost the fight. And he was smaller than Cassian, but faster. And the next 4 seconds were not clean or controlled or anything other than 2 men on a concrete floor trying to end each other. Holst pulled Silas off Cassian by the back of his collar with his functional arm. 3 of the Don's advance men had their weapons out. Silas stood in Holst's grip, breathing hard, his jacket torn, his composure for the first time entirely gone. He looked at Cassian on the floor. He looked at Seraphine. He looked at the room. He had nothing left to look at that was going to help him. Cassian got to one knee. His left arm wasn't cooperating at all now, and the shoulder had gone past pain into a numbness that he knew from experience was its own kind of warning. He got to his feet anyway. He stood, and he breathed, and he looked at Silas. Seraphine crossed the room in 6 steps. She didn't look at Silas. She looked at Cassian, at his arm, at his face, assessing the way she assessed everything, fast and specific and without wasted attention. She put her hand against his chest. Not a gesture of comfort, a check. Feeling his breathing, his heartbeat, the steadiness of him. He put his right hand over hers. She looked up at him. Behind them, Ferrante's voice, entirely calm, as though a man hadn't just discharged a firearm in a room full of Mafia Dons. I think we should finish the signing. He picked up his pen from the table where it had fallen, set it back on the first document, and one by one, across the room, the others reached for their own pens. Because the session was real, and the documents were real, and what had just happened in this room was real, and every man present understood with the absolute clarity of people who had been making permanent decisions their entire adult lives that there was no version of the next 5 minutes in which any of them walked away from what had been started here tonight. Silas looked at the table, at the pens, at the faces of men who had known him, in some cases for years, who had taken his calls and valued his intelligence and considered him a useful node in their respective networks, and who were now looking at him with the specific expression of people who have finished their calculation and arrived at a number that has no room for sentiment in it. Holst tightened his grip, and Seraphine turned from Cassian, and she walked back to the head of the table, and she set the document cases down, and she opened them, and she looked at Silas Creed one time, one single, level look that contained everything she knew about him and everything she had built against him and the full weight of the 14 months during which he had been inside her network, breathing her air, dismantling her trust from the inside. And then she looked away from him and she picked up her own pen. "Let's finish this," she said. The signing took 22 minutes. Not because the documents were complicated. The men in that room had been reading covenant language since childhood, had grown up hearing it read aloud at their fathers' tables the way other families read other things aloud. It took 22 minutes because each Don took the time to read what he was signing, fully, without being rushed, and because that was the kind of room it was, a room where the weight of a thing was acknowledged before the pen touched the paper. Silas Creed watched from the east wall where Holst held him, 2 of the advance men flanking the position. He watched with the expression of someone who has run every remaining calculation and found that they all terminate at the same place. Not defeat exactly. Defeat implies a clean ending, a moment where one side wins and the other concedes. What was happening at that table was something more absolute than defeat. It was erasure. The systematic dismantling of every piece of leverage he had spent 14 months constructing, ratified in covenant language that would outlast every person in the room. He said nothing. That was the thing Seraphine noticed. In the space between signing sessions, between Ferrante's pen lifting from the page and Marchetti's descending, she looked at Silas and found a man who had gone completely quiet. Not the quiet of someone who had stopped fighting, the quiet of someone who had moved past the current moment into a calculation she couldn't see yet. She looked at Holst, made a small gesture with 2 fingers. Holst tightened his grip and shifted his stance, repositioning so that his body was between Silas and the table. Good. Holst read rooms the way she did, by feel, by the specific texture of a silence. Prescott signed last. He was the youngest in the room, and he signed with the particular deliberateness of someone who understood that this moment was going to be part of the story of his tenure for as long as his tenure lasted. He set the pen down and looked at Seraphine and said, "It's done." She looked at the signatures on the page. 11 names, the full quorum required by the codicil. The session was formally complete, formally ratified, formally on the record in the Covenant archive that she would return to the basement of the Vescari estate before morning. The leverage was gone. She looked at Silas. He was already looking at her. "The documentation package," she said. "The vault in the financial district." He said nothing. "It's now evidence in a covenant breach proceeding. Every family in this room has standing to pursue its recovery." She looked at him steadily. "But I'm asking you directly. The location of the master copy, the full biometric access protocol. Give it to me now, in front of these witnesses, and what happens next is determined by this council. Refuse, and what happens next is determined by each family independently." The distinction she was drawing was not subtle, and everyone in the room understood it. Council determination meant process, formal covenant enforcement, structured consequence, the kind of outcome that had rules around it. Individual family determination meant the 11 men at the table each pursuing their own interest in their own way, on their own timeline, without coordination or constraint. Silas looked at her for a long time. He looked at the table, at the faces. He said, "Vault address is 14 Caro Financial Plaza, sublevel 3, box registered under the name Aldrich Venn. Biometric is right index fingerprint plus a 6-digit code." He paused. "The code is 291847. The room was very quiet. Ferrante's head of protocol, Ducci, who had been standing near the north wall since the Dons arrived, who had been doing exactly what he always did at these sessions, which was witness and document, wrote the information down without being asked. Silas looked at Seraphine. "That's everything." "I know," she said. And she did know. She could hear in his voice the specific flatness of someone who had stopped performing. The code, the address, the name. They were real. She would verify them within the hour, but she already knew they were real. "Sit down," she said. Holst guided him to a chair along the east wall. He sat. Cassian's shoulder was dislocated. Holst confirmed it in the corridor outside the main room at 10:40, pressing 2 fingers against the joint with professional assessment and a face that expressed nothing. "You need a hospital." "Not yet." "Cassian." "An hour." He looked at the door to the main room. Through it, he could hear the low murmur of the Dons beginning to talk. The particular sound of men who have just done a significant thing and are beginning to process what comes next. An hour, and then a hospital. Holst looked at him the way Holst looked at things he disagreed with but had decided to accept. 45 minutes. Fine. He went back into the room. Seraphine was at the far end of the table, speaking quietly with Ferrante. The old man was leaning on his cane and listening with his head slightly tilted, the posture of someone giving their full attention to something they intended to remember accurately. Cassian didn't interrupt. He stood near the door and watched and let himself, for a moment that he wouldn't have permitted himself earlier in the day, feel the full dimension of what he was looking at. 18 years, the whole architecture of it, the things he'd known and the things he hadn't, and the vast, intricate structure of what she had been doing in the spaces between. The relationships, the negotiations, the quiet work that had no visible face and no formal credit and no ceremony. The empire he had believed was his, built on land she had prepared, through channels she had opened, sustained by trust she had cultivated with people he had never thought to ask about. He had stood in a ballroom and handed a necklace to another woman in front of all of them. He had no word for what he felt about that. Not shame exactly. Shame was too simple, too self-focused. What he felt was closer to the specific grief of understanding a thing too late, of seeing the full shape of something only after you have already acted against it irreversibly. Except it wasn't irreversible. That was the part he was still adjusting to. She was still here. They were in this room together. Whatever the next conversation was going to cost both of them, it was still a conversation that could happen. Ferrante finished whatever he was saying to Seraphine, straightened slightly, and looked across the room at Cassian. He held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he nodded. The single, deliberate nod of a man issuing a judgment he had been considering for a long time. It wasn't absolution, it wasn't condemnation, it was acknowledgement. I see what you did, and I see where you are now, and I'll remember both. Cassian nodded back. Rissa was found at 11:20. Not by Holst's people. By 2 members of the Circle who had not been among the 12 whose names Silas held, women who had been active in the network long enough that their instincts about when a situation was moving ran ahead of any explicit instruction. They found her at a transit station in the Western District with a single bag and a ticket that would have put her on a train leaving at midnight. She came without resistance. That was the first thing Seraphine registered when they brought her into the secondary room off the main corridor of the warehouse. She came without resistance, which was not the behavior of someone who believed they'd done nothing wrong and was not the behavior of someone who was going to fight. It was the behavior of someone who had already accepted the weight of what was coming and had decided to carry it standing up. Seraphine looked at her across the room. Rissa looked back. 16 years. The kitchen table and the 2 cups of tea, and the 19 years of mornings and late nights, and the particular intimacy of women who work together in the dark, who know each other's rhythms and fears and capabilities without ever having formally cataloged them. Seraphine said, "Why?" Rissa said, "My daughter." The room was very still. "He found her," Rissa said. Her voice was flat, not emotionless. The flatness of someone who has cried about a thing so many times in private that the public version has been worn smooth. 3 years ago, he found her and he documented her, and what she'd been involved in was enough. She stopped. She was 23. She made a terrible decision at 23, and she spent 2 years in a very bad situation because of it, and she got out of it, and she has been clean and clear for 4 years. She has a son, my grandson. She looked at Seraphine. He said if I didn't cooperate, the documentation would go to a federal contact who would reopen the case. She would lose the boy. She would go back inside. A pause. So I cooperated. The silence after she finished was the kind that has texture, the kind where you can feel every person in the room processing what they've been given and what it changes and what it doesn't. Seraphine said, "How much did he get from you?" "Everything he asked for. 14 months of everything he asked for." Risa's jaw worked. "I told myself I was managing it, giving him enough to keep him satisfied without giving him the parts that would actually damage the circle's structure. I told myself I was protecting you." "You weren't." "No." The word was quiet and absolute. "I wasn't. I was protecting my daughter, and I told myself a story about protecting you so I could live with it." She looked at Seraphine with the eyes of someone who has stopped requiring forgiveness and has settled for something more durable: honesty. "I know what I did. I know what it cost. I'm not going to tell you it was worth it, because that's not the kind of thing you get to decide for yourself when the cost lands on someone else." Seraphine was quiet for a long time. She looked at the floor. She looked at the wall. She looked at Risa. "Your daughter," she said. "What's her name?" Risa looked at her. "Marin." "And the boy?" "Eli. He's 4. Seraphine nodded slowly. She looked at the table. "The documentation Creed held on Marin. It's part of the package that goes into the Circle's archive when we recover the vault contents tonight." She looked at Risa. "It will be sealed. Not destroyed, sealed. Under covenant protection, accessible only by unanimous council vote with full quorum." She paused. "Which means it will never see a federal contact. Not because I'm protecting you, because I'm protecting her." Risa said nothing. Her eyes did the thing that eyes do when a person has been holding something for a very long time, and the holding becomes, unexpectedly, no longer necessary. "You're out of the circle," Seraphine said. "That's not punitive. It's structural. You understand that?" "Yes." "And I need to know everything you gave him. Every conversation, every document, every piece of information. Full inventory. It will take as long as it takes." "I'll give you everything," Risa said. "I've been keeping my own record. I knew this day was coming." She reached into the bag she was carrying and removed a small bound notebook, set it on the table. "It's all in there." Seraphine looked at the notebook, at Risa's hand that had set it down and was now flat on the table, not shaking. She reached out and put her own hand over Risa's, briefly. 1 second. The pressure of a woman acknowledging something that had no clean name but had to be acknowledged anyway. Then she picked up the notebook and walked out of the room. The vault was accessed at 12:51 in the morning by 2 members of Ferrante's family, accompanied by Ducci and one of Seraphine's remaining trusted contacts in the financial district, who had the after-hours access credentials for Caro Financial Plaza. The biometric was Silas's finger, which required Silas's physical presence, which required Holst to transport him across the city in the back of a vehicle with his wrists bound and his face entirely empty of whatever had been animating it for the past 14 months. He pressed his finger to the reader. He spoke the 6 digits. The box opened. The package was exactly what he had described: a hard drive, 3 physical document binders, and a sealed envelope that contained the verification key for the digital copies stored on an offshore server. All of it was removed and transferred to Ducci's custody under witness of the 2 Ferrante family members, who signed a formal receipt of transfer that would go into the Covenant archive alongside the session documents from tonight. On the way back to the warehouse, Holst said to Silas, "You gave it up clean." Silas looked out the window of the vehicle. "It was gone the moment the session was ratified. Holding on to the physical copy would have cost more than it was worth. Some men hold on anyway." "Some men," Silas said, "don't know how to count." It was the most honest thing he had said all night. Holst didn't respond to it. The vehicle moved through the empty streets of the city, and Silas watched the buildings go by with the expression of someone memorizing a view they won't be seeing again for a long time. Cashin's shoulder was relocated at 1:15 in the morning by a physician who made private calls and asked no questions. The kind of doctor who existed in specific proximity to this specific world, who had seen this category of injury enough times that the procedure was routine. It hurt in the way that things hurt when your body has been operating past its limits for hours, and the adrenaline finally leaves the room. He sat on the edge of the examination table and breathed through his teeth. And when it was done, he sat still for a moment with his eyes closed and his right hand braced against his knee. Seraphine was in the doorway. She had been in the doorway for the last portion of the procedure, which he hadn't known until he opened his eyes. He looked at her. She looked back. He said, "You could have told me about the archive, about the circle, about any of it." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for long enough that he knew she was giving the question the answer it deserved rather than the answer that was easiest. "Because telling you would have meant watching you decide what to do with the information. And I didn't trust, for a long time I didn't trust, that what you decided to do with it would be the right thing." She looked at the floor. "That's not a flattering thing to say to someone you've been married to for 18 years. It's an honest one." "Yes." He looked at the bandaging on his shoulder, at his hands, at the floor. "The document Vivienne brought, the one from 4 years ago." He looked up at her. "You've known for 3 years." "Yes." "You never—" "No." Her voice was very quiet. "I contained it. I managed the consequences of it without telling you I was doing it, and without telling you I knew. Because if I'd told you, you would have spent the last 3 years trying to manage my knowledge of it rather than letting me manage the actual problem." She paused. "I'm not saying that was right. I'm saying it was what I did and why." He was quiet for a long time. The physician had moved to the other side of the room with the professional discretion of someone who understood when their physical presence in a space was the least important thing in it. "What do we do with it?" Cassian said. "The thing I did, 4 years ago. It's in the archive now, under the same seal as Maren Ven's documentation. Same terms." She looked at him. "It doesn't disappear. It becomes part of the record that no one can weaponize." She paused. "That's the best outcome I could build for it. I've known that for 3 years. He stood up. His shoulder protested and he registered the protest and filed it. He stood in front of her in the doorway of a room that smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness of a space used for functional rather than comfortable purposes. And he looked at his wife with the eyes of a man who has spent a very long night learning the dimensions of something he had been living inside without understanding its shape. "I'm sorry," he said. "For last night." She looked at him. Her face was tired. Not the trained tirelessness she'd been wearing all day. Actually tired. The underlying exhaustion of a person who has been running a complex operation on insufficient sleep after a significant emotional blow, and who is now, in this specific moment, too depleted to manage the surface anymore. "I know you are," she said. "That's not—" He stopped. "I'm not asking you to accept it. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to say it where you could hear it." She looked at him for a long time. Then she stepped back from the doorway and turned toward the corridor and said, over her shoulder, "Come on. We have to be back before 3. What?" He followed her. "Awesome." The Dons met one final time at the warehouse at 2 in the morning, a brief session, 20 minutes, to formally acknowledge receipt of the package materials and establish the covenant process for the breach proceedings against Silas Creed. The proceedings would be internal to the Accord, conducted under the Covenant's own enforcement mechanism, which was older and in many ways more comprehensive than anything available in the formal legal system, and which had the particular advantage of arriving at outcomes that stayed arrived at. Silas was present for the first 5 minutes of the session, long enough to hear the formal charges read into the Covenant record. He sat with his hands in his lap and his face composed, and he did not speak. When Holst escorted him out of the room, he walked without resistance and without theater. Whatever Silas Creed was, he was not a man who performed his losses for an audience. Ferrante, after he left, said, "What do we do about the families he had assets inside?" Seraphine said, "That's a question for each family to answer in their own time. The documentation I'm providing tonight includes everything Risa's notebook gave us about the specific contacts. How you handle your own people is your business." She looked around the table. What matters is that you handle it before it handles you. The old man nodded. And the circle? The circle will restructure. New council composition, new security protocols, full review of every relationship that existed during the period of Risa's cooperation. She paused. It will take time. In the interim, the back-channel stabilization functions will run through reduced capacity. Things will be slower, less smooth. She looked at each of them in turn. I'm telling you this so you can plan for it rather than be surprised by it. Prescott said, How long? 6 months? Maybe 8. He nodded. Accepted it. That was the thing about the men in this room. Whatever their other qualities, they were pragmatists. They dealt with what was real. Ferrante looked at Cassian. And your household? Cassian said, My household is intact. The old man looked at him with the particular patience of someone who is waiting for the full answer and will wait as long as it takes. Cassian looked back at him, and then he looked at Seraphine beside him, and he said, My household is intact, and it is being run as it should have been run from the beginning. Ferrante nodded, picked up his cane, stood. Good, he said. Then we're done here. Bossa. They were the last ones out of the warehouse at 2:47 in the morning. Cassian carried the document cases. His left arm was in a temporary support brace, and the shoulder was a persistent ache that would be a more serious conversation tomorrow. But he carried the cases in his right arm, and Seraphine walked beside him through the warehouse to the main exit, their footsteps the only sound in the empty building. Outside, the city was the kind of quiet it only achieved in the deep middle of the night. Not silent, but reduced. The background noise of daytime stripped away to leave only the essential sounds. Somewhere distant, a truck. The low movement of wind through the street. The particular smell of a city at 3 in the morning, cooler than it had been. The concrete giving back the day's heat slowly. The air carrying traces of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Vivian was waiting outside. She was standing by the building wall with her coat finally on properly. Collar up, hands in pockets. And she looked, more than anything else, like someone who had been waiting for permission to leave and hadn't been certain it was going to come. Seraphine stopped in front of her. Vivian said, I know I don't get to ask for anything. No, Seraphine said. You don't. A pause. I want to say, I know what you want to say. Seraphine looked at her, not with warmth, not with coldness, but with the specific attention of a woman who had been reading people's actual content beneath their presented surface for 2 decades. You made a choice tonight that cost you something and helped someone else. That's in the record too. She paused. What you do with the rest of it is yours. Vivian looked at her for a moment, nodded once. Then she looked at Cassian, just briefly, a look that carried everything it needed to carry and nothing extra. And she turned and walked down the street and didn't look back. They watched her go. Cassian said, She'll be all right. Probably, Seraphine said. She's harder than she looked. Most people are. He said it without irony and without particular emphasis, and she heard in it something that was about more than Vivian, and she didn't respond to it directly because the hour was late, and they were both running on the far side of exhaustion, and some conversations needed daylight and coffee and the ordinary texture of a morning to be had properly. The car came. Ord, who had been waiting since midnight with the patience of someone long accustomed to waiting in cars for however long was required, got out and opened the door without being asked. He looked at Cassian's arm. He looked at Seraphine's face. He said nothing, which was exactly right. Cassian held the door for her. She got in. He got in beside her. The door closed. They didn't speak for the first 10 minutes of the drive. The city moved past the windows. The distance between where they'd been and where they were going measured itself in streets and intersections and the particular rhythm of a city at night. Then Seraphine said, The necklace is still on Vivian's coffee table, at the apartment. Cassian was quiet for a moment. I'll have someone collect it. Don't. She looked at her hands in her lap. Leave it for now. I don't want it back because it was collected. She paused. I want it back when it means the right thing. He looked at her. In the passing light from the street, her face moved between shadow and illumination in the alternating rhythm of the drive. He looked at the lines of it. Not the public face, not the composed surface she wore in rooms full of people who needed to believe she was immovable. just the actual face. The one he had been waking up beside for 18 years and had, at some point he couldn't precisely locate, stopped actually seeing. "What does it need to mean?" he said. She thought about it for long enough that he knew she was being serious rather than deflecting. That the person offering it understands what it is, not a symbol of possession, not a ceremony for the room, what it actually is. She looked out the window. A covenant, between equals. She paused. "I've been the Donna of the Continental Accord since before I met you. That doesn't go away, and it doesn't get handed over, and it doesn't depend on what you do or don't do. But what it means inside our household, that's something different. That's something that has to be chosen." She turned and looked at him. Not performed, chosen. He looked back at her. The car moved through the city. The streets were quieter now, the last of the night settling into its deepest hour before the first edge of morning began to dilute the dark. He said, "I chose wrong. Yes. I know what I chose toward and I know what I chose against, and I've known it since this morning when I stood in my own kitchen, and the coffee wasn't there." He held her gaze. "I don't know how to fix 18 years of not seeing clearly. I don't know if that's even a thing that can be fixed, but I know what I want to choose going forward, and it's not what I chose last night." He paused. "If that's something, if there's anything there to work with." She looked at him for a long time. Outside the first suggestion of dawn was beginning at the edge of the sky. Not light yet, just the absence of the deepest dark, the eastern horizon beginning to separate itself from the night above it. She said, "There's something there." He breathed, just breathed, the careful, full breath of a man who has been holding something that has now been set down. She turned back to the window, and they rode in silence the rest of the way, and the silence was different from every other silence of the past 24 hours. Not the silence of withheld things, not the silence of calculations being made, not the silence of a room absorbing a public cruelty. Just two people in a car in the early morning, sitting with the weight of what had happened and what had been said and what came next, letting it be what it was without rushing it toward a shape. The document cases went back into the archive at 4 in the morning. Cashin carried them down the stairs himself, his right arm managing what the left couldn't, and set them on the central table where the covenant record of the night's session was added to the archive's inventory. The deactivated door sensor had been replaced by Holst's people earlier in the evening. The room was as it should be, shelved, sealed, indexed, the accumulated memory of a century of agreements that had kept the peace more reliably than any amount of force ever had. He looked at the shelves for a moment before he left, at the history in them, at what it had taken to build it and what it had taken to preserve it, and who had done that preserving in the years when he had been the visible face of an operation that ran on invisible foundations. He turned off the light and closed the door. The emergency summit was called for 48 hours later, in a formal venue this time. Not the warehouse, not the Meridian Grand, but a private estate in the northern reaches of the city, whose owner owed Ferrante a debt of sufficient vintage that the request to use it had been honored without hesitation. All 11 Dons came. Their formal attendance was a statement in itself. Seraphine presided. She had not presided over an accord session in the formal sense before this. Her role had always been the architecture beneath the visible structure, the relationship behind the ceremony, the hand that was never shown. Standing at the head of the room now, in the position that the covenant record formally designated as the Donna's chair, she was something different. Not less private. She would always be fundamentally private. That was in her nature as much as anything was. But visible in a way she had never been and was choosing now to be. She presented the case against Silas Creed in full. The 14 months of infiltration. The specific manipulations at each stage. Risa's compelled cooperation and its scope. The role Vivian had played and the choice she had made at the end. The breach of covenant at the summit. The documentation package and its recovery. She presented it without editorializing. Just the facts, in sequence, with the documentation supporting each one. Let the room draw its own conclusions. When she finished, she said, "I'm also presenting a proposal for restructuring the Accord's governance to address the vulnerabilities this episode revealed." Ferrante said, "Let's hear it." It was a straightforward proposal in concept, more complex in execution. The Circle of Mothers would be formally recognized within the Accord's governance structure rather than operating as an unofficial shadow layer. The back-channel stabilization functions would be brought into a formal auxiliary council with defined authority and defined accountability, visible enough to be protected, private enough to function. The Donna's role would be formally codified in the Covenant record, with defined powers and defined independence from the dawn of any individual household. It meant the women who had been doing the actual work of holding the network together for decades would be doing it on record instead of in silence. Prescott said, "That's a significant structural change." "Yes," Seraphine said. "Some families are going to resist it." "Yes." She looked at him evenly. "And those families should think carefully about what it cost all of us to operate the way we've been operating, about what the unofficial structure enabled in terms of infiltration, about what a shadow layer costs when someone figures out how to get inside it." She paused. "Visibility is not the same as vulnerability. In this case, it's the opposite." The vote was not unanimous. 2 families abstained, which was their right under Covenant procedure. 9 voted in favor, including Ferrante, whose vote carried a weight of endorsement that the abstentions couldn't offset. The restructuring was ratified. It would take months to implement. There would be friction, resistance, specific arguments about specific provisions that would need to be negotiated one relationship at a time. It would be, in short, exactly the kind of work that Seraphine had been doing in one form or another since she was 23 years old, assigned to a young Don who didn't know he needed her. She could do that work. She had always been able to do that work. The difference was that now she would do it in her own name. Done. The necklace came back 3 weeks later, not retrieved by a courier, not left on a table. Cashin brought it himself on a Tuesday morning that was ordinary in every external respect. Coffee that was there, at the right temperature, on the kitchen counter, and he set it on the table between them, and he did not make a speech about it, and did not frame it in the language of gesture or ceremony. He said, "I read the original Covenant language, the full codicil, the section on the Donna designation." He looked at the necklace on the table. "I wanted to understand what I was actually giving back before I gave it back." She looked at the necklace, at the platinum links, the miniature crests, the black diamond pendant that had been fastened around the wrong woman's throat 11 days ago in a room full of people who had understood immediately what it meant and what it would cost. She looked at him, at the lines of his face in the morning light, the silver at his temples, the permanent slight tension in his jaw, the eyes that had looked at her this morning, the way they had looked at her across a room 19 years ago when they had met for the first time, and she had been thinking about the strategy and he had been thinking about her. She picked up the necklace. She did not put it on. She held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the actual physical weight, and the other weight, the century of agreements and obligations and quiet female authority that the physical object had been designed to represent. Then she set it down on the table again, and she reached across and she put her hand over his. "Thank you," she said, "for reading it." The morning light came through the kitchen window. The coffee sat at the right temperature on the counter. Outside, the city was beginning its day with the indifferent, ongoing energy of a thing that does not stop for any particular human reckoning. She picked up the necklace one more time. She considered it in the light. She thought about Donna's authority being recognized the moment every king willingly bows. Not compelled, not manipulated, not engineered through 14 months of patient infiltration, but willingly, because they finally understood what they had been looking at all along. She fastened it at her own throat. Cassian watched her. She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the ordinary morning light of a house that had been, for better and worse and everything between, theirs. And she let him see, without the trained surface, without the composed stillness, without the management of any of it, exactly who she was and what she had built and what it had cost her to build it and what she intended to do with whatever came next. He saw her. For the first time in the way that actually counted, he saw her. And he said nothing, because some things are larger than the language available for them, and the right response to standing in front of something that large is not to try to match it with words, but simply to stay in the room with it. He stayed. The city moved outside the window. The coffee cooled slowly toward a temperature that was still exactly right, and the legend of the Donna necklace rewrote itself, not in a ballroom with 500 witnesses, but in a kitchen at an ordinary hour, between 2 people learning, late, imperfectly, with the specific cost that all real learning carries, how to see each other clearly. That was how it ended. Not with a ceremony, with the morning.